Okay, we're on to part 3 of Karl Marx's Capital. It starts out with Chapter 7, the labor process and the valorization process. Section 1 is the labor process. So in Chapter 7, Marx writes about what he calls absolute surplus value. He starts the chapter off by noting the relation between the worker and the capitalist. Namely, that the worker's labor power is released in production when they're working for the capitalist. And this is all pretty obvious to someone who's ever had a job. Marx is describing employment. But he also notes that the labor of the worker is not artificial in that it exists outside of nature. Humans exist in nature. We interact with nature. We do work within it using the raw materials supplied by it. Marx says, what distinguishes human labor from, for example, a spider building a web or a beaver building a dam, is that humans can conceive of the final product and consciously go about achieving it. Now, Marx describes the instruments of labor. He says, an instrument of labor is a thing or complex of things which the worker interposes between himself and the object of his labor, and which serves as a conductor, directing his activity onto the object. So you can think of an axe or a screwdriver or something. We know from the finding of simple stone tools in caves, for example, that humans were using tools a long time ago. Even a stick used to get fruit from a tree counts as an instrument of labor. We take raw materials such as wood, we apply our labor to them to turn them into things of use value. We can use animals as instruments of labor, as they're useful in farming for non-industrialized agriculture. Animals can also be considered raw material, providing human labor has not got into producing them. Some products of human labor become both raw materials and instruments of labor. Marx talks a lot about spindles, as an example, which is used in spinning cotton and after a while gets used up. It's not super important to know the details of 19th century textile manufacturing. Just understand that spindles are parts of a spinning machine that need to be occasionally replaced once their use value has been exhausted. There is an important point to be understood here. Production itself is a consumptive process, namely, it consumes the means of production. Marx notes that a machine that is not active in the labor process is useless, in the context that it isn't producing anything. He notes that machines rust and wear down, even when they aren't being used due to natural processes. Raw materials that aren't used are wasted. Marx writes, living labor must seize upon these things, waken them from the dead, change them from merely possible use values into real use values. Labor isn't just done on raw materials nature provides. Products are produced for the production process as well, like the spindles. You can even have long chains of production where a commodity is produced by person A and sold to person B, who then does labor on it, producing a different commodity, who then sells it to C, and so on. Marx makes a distinction between consumptive and productive labor. Both consume raw materials, but there's a difference in what the goal is. Consumptive labor is the labor you do on raw materials for yourself. The gardener that grows and then eats their own food, for example. Productive labor is where commodities are made. You produce something for someone else. So Marx then turns to the capitalist, who hires the labor power on the market, provides the laborer with the means of production, and takes the product of that labor. This process where the capitalist consumes the labor of the worker has two attributes. First, the worker works under the control of the capitalist, and the capitalist makes sure the work is done well, materials aren't wasted, and tools aren't abused. Second, the product is the property of the capitalist, not the producer. If the capitalist pays for a day's labor power, then the result of that labor power belongs to the capitalist. From the capitalist's perspective, he's just buying labor power and consuming it in the production process. The capitalist just needs to supply the means of production.